Hello, everyone, and welcome. I am Stephanie Pedroza, Senior Marketing Manager at Origo Software Technologies. Thank you so much for joining us for the top 5 mistakes that owners make when managing construction projects today. It's going to be a very fun discussion, and we'll get started. But a few quick notes before we get started. The webinar will be recorded, and we will provide all registered participants with the recording. The slide will also be provided to all registered participants. At the end of the presentation, we will have room for questions at the end. So I want to introduce our guest panelists. We have Kent Barnes, the former Chief Engineer of Montana Department of Transportation. And we also have Bryan Byler, the Technology Consultant at COO at Aptitude, who also has a lot of experience with consultants and public agencies. So gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you so much for doing this discussion. And before we get started, we're going to launch a quick poll just to get to know who's in our audience. So if everyone can take a couple of seconds to go up on the screen and submit your questions. Which of the following best describes your organization? And if you can submit the poll questions, it looks like we have about 7% of the attendees submitting the questions. All right, when we hit about 50%, we will go ahead and share the results. All right. So it looks like the majority of the organizations, we have roads and bridges, water and wastewater, and transit and rail. All right. Now the next question, which of the following best describes your role? So if you can take a couple of seconds and submit the poll. So once we get to 50%, we will move on. All right. So 60%, we have project managers, capital planning and finance, engineering, and consultants. Okay. All right, well, let's begin our discussion. Oh, and now I can't find my questions. All right, well, let's begin. So today's webinar, we're going to discuss the top 5 challenges that agencies make when managing their construction programs. Above, we're going to see some of the type 5 challenges that are discussing. And when it comes to managing construction programs, this can cost a lot of money, multi-million dollars, and even worse, it can also be deadly for the people in our community. So let's dive right in, and if you guys can bear with me because I am having technical difficulties right now, so I do apologize. But let's get started with the cumbersome submittal process. So cumbersome submittal process for construction projects, it's always very complex. There's a lot of different moving pieces that are going along. And I'm going to start the discussion and have you start, Brent. What are the current challenges that you're seeing with the submittal process when it comes to managing capital programs or capital projects?
I'm sorry, was that me?
Sorry.
Yes, Ken.
Oh, thank you. This process that you see here is very important to the overall project. There is absolutely no question about that. You have lines of communication and documentation that has to occur. The bad part of it is exactly that. It is formal, it is written, it is rigid. It's like the old school book thing or school trial thing where you have a ring of people and you start at one side and you whisper a secret into the ear of the person next to you. And that goes around the room until it finally comes back to you. And the story you hear is 100% different than what you started out with. These processes that are so important to us are subject to the same sort of thing. You have a subcontractor way at one end and a sub-consultant way at the other end that has to review and respond and process. And there can be a lot lost in that communication chain. It's written, it's the person that wrote it, it was 100% clear. The person that read it, it's a 100% clear, and it makes no sense at all. They're answering a different question than they got. There needs to be other lines of communication that also supplement this. They cannot replace this, but they can supplement this informally to allow subcontractor 1 to talk directly to sub-consultant 3, to ask questions, to build it without making firm decisions, because the decisions have to go through this process. You have to, that's what respects the money trail. The money trail follows this, but I need subcontractor 1 to talk to sub-consultant 3 to come to what they think, and then it can go to the general contractor who may be financially affected by that. The A&E, the owner, all of that may be financially affected by that and needs to be in this loop. But the efficiency of it comes from that back channel teamwork that, in my opinion, needs to be promoted, trained for, and worked with. There you go.
Okay, well, that's a whole mouthful. And Bryan, do you want to add anything else to that?
Yeah, I guess just a couple of things that I've seen be really helpful in an otherwise challenging process, just to add on to what Ken already offered there. From an owner's perspective, I think where this works really well is where your AE firm, they're really the ones that are owning this middles process. I mean, technically, we all know the contractor and thereby their subs are necessary for doing the things and submitting all the things back. But when you've got a strong AE firm that's really an advocate for you as the owner, that goes a long way, right? Particularly, when they have internal submittal coordinators. When there's one person that is really triaging everything goes through Rome, that's really beneficial. Ideally, most of these folks are very meticulous, very detail oriented, and they're not going to let anything slip by them. That's really beneficial and oftentimes lacking. If you find that there's too many people touching it or no one is actually coordinating it, advocate for that. Like, hey, who's in charge over there? Even in closer and as AE firms get bigger, sometimes there's whole departments and you see variance in human resources in that capacity. But, also as the owner, I think it's really important to have someone internally with your organization that holds the football. When the submittal coordinator throws to you, you've got to triage it and so on and so forth. GCs typically going to have the project manager do it, as most of us know, and they do a fairly good job getting the responses back. But I think just really strong ownership, clear RACs and responsibilities can help a lot. And the second thing is, I grew up, my father I worked with an architect actually, and I remember getting the boxes of submittals to the house in like big boxes. It was literally all paper. We've come a long way from that. That was very inefficient, but to Kent's point, necessary, right? Literally necessary. Now with the emergence of technologies in a lot of the systems, doing this electronically saves so much time and energy, right? And it's really a no-brainer for most organizations. So I'd say, a key stakeholder, somebody that's truly owning it and triaging it, submittal coordinator at the AEs, and also ideally one internally as an owner, and that with an electronic system to manage it. Because electronic system, aside from being faster, gives everybody visibility. Again, to Ken's point, anyone in the process can look in the system and see where his submittal's at any given point in time, decreases bottlenecks, increases visibility, and increases accountability. And I think those are really important pieces of it.
Now, what challenges emerge when comparing updates on ongoing projects to approved submittals? And Bryan, I'll let you answer that question to begin with.
Work that's already constructed, Stephanie?
Yes. So ongoing projects, what are the updates and what are the challenges that emerge for current work that's already, I guess, the shovel-ready projects is what they call them?
Yeah, I think it's just validation, right? Who's doing the validation, who's doing the inspection, right? Certainly, the AE is approving or rubber stamping whether the installation is acceptable or not. Where I see issues with that is in areas like value engineering, right? Hey, particularly in the advent of COVID and the supply chain issues we're having, material A isn't available. We can get material B or C. Which one's appropriate? We see material substitutions being challenging. Oftentimes, methods substitution can be really challenging, and that's where we rely on our engineers, and those folks with those advanced technical degrees to really vet out that solution. Because ultimately, in those situations, what was done was not what was originally designed, and it's probably still acceptable. The architect's still going to approve it or approve as noted. But I think those are the areas I see the most challenging when there's design change and stuff like that.
And Kent, do you want to add to that?
I would add just a little bit to that. I totally agree with what you're saying there. I really like the concept there of ownership. When we talk about updates and changes and those things going on, someone owns that, and someone is a champion of that, and that person, whatever entity that is, they need to really step up and take that and be responsible for it. The electronic submittal process can really help that out, in my humble opinion. But someone needs to be that owner of it and that champion of it that is making sure that everything is going where it should go and can respond as needed as it comes along.
Great. Now, what would you gentlemen envision the ideal submittal process for large construction projects? What can alleviate all these headaches when it comes to the cumbersome submittal process? And Kent, I'll start with you.
Like I said earlier, this process that you see on the slide is extremely important. That's your documentation, that documents your flow of money, that documents everything. Electronically, that works slick. It can go through fast. Ideally, that is a process on top of everything. But underneath that, there has to be teamwork. There has to be lines of communication that allow, like I say, sub-consultants to talk to subcontractors to help resolve some of the issues. We talk about the value engineering. We talk about material substitutions. It's very important for whoever, it's a supplier way at one end and he wants to substitute something, that can have an impact on the general contractor, that can have an impact on the A&E, that can have an impact on the sub-consultant. The ability to have some informal lines of communication underneath all of that people understand are informal lines of communication and not decision-making processes, because the decision-making process is the formal process. Team building with across the whole line of the project so that can occur, and with a good, solid, and I really do think that the electronic submittal process and having a good process there that everyone is on board with, it can make everything flow so much better. But you need that team behind there that can communicate and make things work well.
Yeah, I think team communication and just communication overall is very important, which we will be talking about sooner. But Bryan, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I think just to emphasize the importance, as Ken alluded to there, of cross-functional stakeholders, right? So, sometimes submittal process is kind of viewed as submittals are going over there, right? And they're not important to me until I need to construct the thing that's pending, right? And that can work, but when submittals really become embedded in your construction process and your delivery process, it's much more cohesive, right? We should be talking about submittals in our OAC meetings, right? We should be talking about submittals in our project management meetings. We should be talking about it, on staff meetings, and that kind of, to Ken's point, those informal discussions, this needs to be on meeting agendas. So it's not like submittals is like a process that happens over here in parallel, which too often I think it feels like when it's really embedded into the construction process as one of many ongoing work streams, more people are looking at it. Again, more accountability, and it becomes more cross-functional. And instead of the 5 or 7 people you see here on the slide, it's 27 people that all have a vested interest suddenly in these submittals, even though the whole project does. Getting more people involved and participating is going to be beneficial.
Okay. So I'm going to move on to the next challenge that we see, and I think it's fund management challenge, which I think is what keeps a lot of employees up at night. It's going over funds, not having enough money. Where is the money coming from? And Bryan, what are some main challenges that you see agencies face when managing funds for their capital projects?
Dinosaur tech is my favorite one. 20 years ago, we'd use Access databases and stuff to manage this kind of thing. And a number of agencies I've worked with still are, and you can do that, as we did for multiple decades. But I think it's definitely time to kind of modernize the tech stack in this case in a lot of places. It's where you see challenges. I mean, there are a lot of homegrown fund management systems used by many, many, many organizations, which, hey, at some point, if it ain't broken, don't fix it, they say. Well, they're becoming broken. And if they're not truly breaking, they're slowing things down, and we're realizing more and more, time is money. So I think the biggest issues I see related to this are when you don't have a system that has like real-time updates, has things like low balance alerts, or, can manage fund dependencies, can manage fund expirations. Famously, I think of a project I worked in Chicago where they managed significant amounts of funding. Actually, ironically, it wasn't an Access database. The gentleman who administered it left the organization with the keys to the database. And they were, without access to their fund management for a period of a few weeks. And it happened that some of the funds, some bonds and stuff expired in that about 1 month window. So it was a very significant impact that was totally, totally preventable.
Yeah, that is probably the worst case scenario, is if somebody leaves, somebody retires, and they're the only people with access to those funds. And Kent, I'm going to move on to the next question. How can agencies prioritize spending and allocating funds across different projects?
I come from the Department of Transportation. That was one of my tasks as a bridge engineer, was how do I prioritize the funding that I've got? I've got some allocation of money. I've got some embedded funds that are in other projects, but we're trying to optimize our whole system. And that is a difficult process. What you're looking at there, though, is some sort of asset management system. And in the modern world, hopefully those asset management systems are starting at construction time. If I'm starting out with a project and I'm building and I'm using a building management system of some sort to build it, I can carry that through the life cycle of my structure. But from a bridge standpoint, from a highway standpoint, you're doing asset management and then trying to prioritize where can I spend my money best to optimize my system. It seems like that should be a simple system, and it's really not, because anyone, I know there's DOT folks here, they know that there are so many moving parts in this, and there are so many different demands between capacity and condition and safety and dollars. I don't have the dollars to go everywhere. So how do I prioritize it? From my standpoint, it was, how do I balance it out? How do I look at it? Where are my worst needs? How can I best balance it? And from my standpoint, it was always, if I can rehab, I'm better off than rebuilding. In many cases, that was exactly what we were trying to do. But allocating funds across different projects is an asset management process that really requires a good understanding of your assets, which really requires a good asset management system in the background to help you out with it.
Okay. And Bryan, how have you seen funds being prioritized and allocated when you've worked with agencies in the past as well?
Yeah, having a good system in place is really, at some level, it's a math problem and it's a scheduling problem, right? And so, typically, right, the construction schedule drives itself due to design and other contingencies. And funding is kind of mashed into that, right? I think organizations that do perhaps the best job at this actually use funding expiration, to really drive the construction schedule, right? Because, there's certain funds that need to be, which sounds silly and backwards to some point, right? But to Ken's point, earlier, follow the money, right? And so it's, the alternative is you're like, hey, I've got, $800,000 expiring at the end of the month, and I don't have anything to spend it on, which is not also an equally bad problem as to not having the money. And so certainly that requires some schedule changes. There are certainly things you can spend it on. We want to spend all the money we get access to, right? But it's just informing funds expiration and funds availability. When are my new funds becoming available with the actual costs? So it becomes really, I call it a math problem that ties deeply into cash flow, right? And if you're getting good clarity into your cash flow, aligning your funding to your cash flow, with your construction schedule, really those three pieces together come, that's how we're doing it successfully. I think that's where project controls teams add a lot of value, and strong project management, and certainly ideally a consolidated tool that has all three of those data points, right? Funds management, cash flow management, project or schedule management in one tool. That makes it so much easier.
Yep, agree. Now, I'm moving on to the next, which is struggling with project visibility, where I think this is where a lot of risk happens, just because not everyone has the same visibility throughout the agency. And what are some main factors leading to the lack of project visibility? And Bryan, I'll start with you.
Not having a consolidated system is probably the biggest one. I mean, nowadays it's just super important. And I say consolidated system because pretty much nowadays everyone has something, right? But, it becomes siloed, right? The AE is going to have their system. The contractor is going to have their system. The owner is going to have their system. And that can work as long as we're doing a good job of sharing information and exchanging it. And there's lots of ways to do that. But it gets disjointed. It's harder to manage. It adds an admin churn that's probably avoidable. And the secondary thing is not having clear SOPs on what information needs to get stored, right? So contractors are always going to have their set of documents, but I think as owners, we have to say like, hey, ideally contractually you require this, right? But if not contractually, you have an SOP that says, these are all the documents that must be in my system. Contractor, you can store them in your systems, that's cool, but they must be in mine. And just getting access, probably on the AE side as well, but like setting a mandate, these project documents, all of the drawings, all of the issuances, all of the specifications. I think people do a good job of those, but there's thousands of other document artifacts that are not often required to be in the owner's system. And so the owner doesn't have visibility into these, right? Which is a risk, actually a legal risk. When in a worst case scenario, you get to court litigation and you're in discovery, and the contractors had all these documents, the owner can say, well, why haven't I had those, right? And that's, it can lead to some significant issues downstream.
And Kent, what do you feel is not talked about enough when it comes to project visibility across the different departments in the agencies?
I think you just hit a whole bunch of the good points. Silos are a real issue, but when I look at it, I look at this slide, information gets lost. Most of the time, information really doesn't get lost. It's there. Team miscommunication. I think that's a big one. Project delays. And I think they all blend together. Let's go back to information gets lost. A lot of the people I see this, a lot of people that are running these systems, and the systems are so important to get information out there and distributed, but the system becomes the absolute God of the system, of everything. That's everything. Oh, I put the information in the system. Okay, well and good. But did that toggle to everyone else along the chain, or did they see it, or did they know it, or did they know to look? A lot of busy people out there, and your bit of information may be very crucial, and it's in the system, but it's effectively lost because of team miscommunication. And what you have going on there is someone is relying on the system to do all of the communication, and a lot of times what you need is a little extra communication to say, oh, I just got this important bit of information, who really needs it, who doesn't really need it. I should make sure that Joe or Mary or whoever knows this. Team miscommunication is one of the issues, and I hate to say it's an over-reliance on technology, but really that's what it comes down to. Quality project management, and I've said this at other times, not here, but quality project management is about working with people. The software is a tool to help you. Unfortunately, a lot of people will lean on that tool too hard and forget about the team communication and the working with people aspect of it. And the result of that can be delays and problems. So I see all that blending together. The information is there, and like you say, the siloing can be a huge issue. It's in this silo, and how does it jump to get to this silo where it really needs to be? That's a big issue, and that's if you can get everyone on a common system, that's all great. But those are how I see it. Really, it's a quality project management is working with people. These complex systems in complex problems are really a necessity, but they're just the tool. They're not they're not the overall solution. They are just the tool.
Yeah, and I'm going to ask one more question before we move into miscommunication, because I think that's the main issue that we're talking about, is just communicating between all of your stakeholders, communicating between all of your employees. Now, we're talking about system as tools where people are relying too much in it. Now, are there instances where contractors are using different tools? There's a lot of silo tools. The ideal situation would be to have a centralized system where everyone has visibility. But how does that affect project delivery when contractors are using different tools and the owners are different tools? And Bryan, I'll give that one to you since you work a lot with agencies.
Yeah, it's, I wish it weren't, but it's often unavoidable. I mean, the contractors are always, we don't get to dictate typically what tools they have. They're always going to use their own systems. My personal opinion is the owners, I'm fairly agnostic on that. Use whatever that you need to do to successfully deliver my project, right? But I need to access that data, right? So it usually feels like in addition to using yours, you will use mine. And again, I think some of the most when I say successful, I mean, defining success in this instance, the owners I've worked with and agencies that have the projects that go according to budget and plan and timeline most often, again, they're getting these things in the contracts with their contractor, right? You will use my tool in addition to your tool, and put it in the warranties and stuff in the contract, and again, prescribing the things that must be there. That's really important. I mean, and nowadays, most of the large GC and CM firms we work with, they're familiar with the owner's tools that are in the market. A lot of them have worked with some of the owner's tools, and we don't get the same pushback we did even 5 or 10 years ago. I mean, 10 years ago, it was like, no, I'm using my system, figure it out. It was harder for owners to leverage that, to get in the contracts. I think nowadays it's becoming certainly much more acceptable and not a surprise. And most of the firms it's also getting a lot more competitive, right? So I think, look, if the firms want to earn your business as an agency or as a partner, then they're going to do that. So I'd say it's a pretty comfortable ask to use both tools nowadays. And the better owner tools are typically set up pretty well to have contractors be users in the system along with you. And to Ken's point earlier, that is the best way to make sure data doesn't get lost, right? When everyone's using the same tool. And a third component, as a former implementer of software, is selecting a vendor that's got a strong implementation team, right, with a good team of business analysts, a good track record of good software implementation that's going to set it up right, is extremely important. Because there's things like document notifications, to Ken's point, like I put in the system. Well, I mean, these systems have the ability to notify people when you upload the document, notify teams, and there's this concept of permissioning the systems correctly. And so that's an important piece of it as well, is just getting the permissions in the systems correct. And just selecting a software vendor that has some reliability there.
And Ken, I don't know if you want to add to that. In your experience working with contractors, what has worked well when there's different systems being used? And
again, we do some specify in some of our contracts what systems have to be used so that we can bring in information and upload it and use it. And I totally agree that this has gotten better as systems have gotten better and better. You know, web usage has really helped with that. But the big thing again is if they're going to have a system and we're going to have a system, it really is going to rely on that communication. And that's going to be pick up the phone, that's going to be send the email, you know, and that makes it awkward because whether you're working with two systems or one system, okay, you've got to do it in my system and your system. Well, that means dual entry oftentimes and that's all awkward. And it's communication that kills us or makes us. And it's communication that makes us. And it's the proactive communicator that's looking for it and hoping for it and working with the team that really makes it.
No, agree. And that guides us into poor communication across stakeholders, which is what we've been talking about. Now, how are we defining stakeholders in the current process? And Kent, I'll let you answer that question.
That's a good question. Poor communication across stakeholders. Who are our stakeholders? I'm going to categorize them into internal and external. Internal stakeholders are in your contracting system. They're somewhere between that, you know, sub-consultant and that's, you know, there's somewhere along that chain of communication that we looked at earlier. Those are all stakeholders on this project. They probably have money invested in it. They have work invested in it. But you also have external stakeholders. And those external stakeholders are the public. And me coming from a transportation standpoint, the public we're impacting the public all the time. There are all kinds of stakeholders out there. Stakeholders shape projects for us. We talk about how much time it takes to develop a project. Stakeholders take time and working through with stakeholders, and stakeholders change, those external ones. So defining that early from a project management, look at the life of a project from concept to completion. Those external stakeholders are involved in the whole thing. Early on, they're interested in what's happening to them, what's it going to mean to them. How do you communicate that to them? How do you incorporate input? How do you adjust a project to? The owner always has a goal and objective in the project. The stakeholders have goals and objectives, and they don't match oftentimes. How are we going to incorporate that, put it all together to come up with a final project that goes out to bid, that goes out to the construction team, however that's done? And then how do we incorporate that in throughout the construction cycle to keep our stakeholders in the communication loop? And one, make sure that we're honoring all of our commitments to them, and two, that we are working to minimize impacts to those stakeholders, negative impacts to those stakeholders. Stakeholders inside, those internal ones, again, those are all along that line that we saw earlier of the submittal process. They're somewhere tied into that. And that's really the topic that I've hit multiple times here is how do we keep those communication lines across all of those people effectively working so that the system itself can work effectively and efficiently.
So I guess the question is, how do we close those communication gaps between internal and external stakeholders? And Bryan, I'll have you start with that.
Oh, that's a doozy. Lots of ways you can do that. I think Kent nailed probably a lot of them, but kind of a theme of the day for me is having a consolidated system, right? If we are communicating using the same systems, email logging is a really important part of this, right? I mean, if the three of us were building a project together and Kent is emailing me and he didn't put you in the CC, or you and I have an email chain and he's on the CC, we've already broken the communication chain, right? And that's easy to do. It happens so often. And then it's like, oh, well, I emailed Kent that last week. Well, I didn't know that, right? And just something as simple as using email, which is a tool obviously we all have to use to do our jobs effectively, just by using it incorrectly can cause significant delays, right? So simple things like using a tool where all of the project correspondences are emailed in, like CC the project inbox type thing. Setting again, default CCs or BCCs. Having just protocols on how you communicate, a communication plan, it can be really beneficial, right? And if everyone sticks to that plan, great. If you find someone is not sticking to the plan, then I think, there's some accountability, like, hey, Stephanie, our communication plan says you have to do X or Y. All project communications have to follow this format or this way. Just having a standard can go a long way. Most organizations don't have a standard, so it ends up being whatever people are comfortable, and unfortunately, that's not always calibrated with what we need to be successful.
And we're getting close to the end of our panel discussion, so I see a couple of questions coming in, so keep those questions coming in. We will be answering questions at the end of the presentation. And the next topic that we're going to discuss is not leveraging historical data. So historical data and just having access to that is really important, just to help manage risk, but also learn from your mistakes. And how does a lack of historical data impact project costs and estimation forecasting? I think there's so many changes that looking at the data back in the 1970s is not going to help us now in 2024. But Bryan, how does a lack of historical data impact cost estimations, but also really, really old historical data? How would that impact cost estimations now?
Yeah, I would define really old nowadays with like 3 years ago, it seems like. But a surprising, startling number of owners, agencies, and entities I've worked with do not properly leverage their historical data. And what I mean by this is past performance data. Ken's built probably thousands of bridges in his career, right? But certainly, engineers probably do the best job of this, right? Like, they build a thing one time, they learn from that, they document the lessons learned. So the next time they build a bridge, guess what? They've learned from the last one. So bridges get subsequently better and better and better, right? Owners aren't doing that, right? It's strange, they'll hire different architects for different projects. There's no documentation of the knowledge. Everything is bespoke and built one-off. So there's tremendous inefficiency in that. When you look at like commercial builders, for example, I live close to Miami, we have a lot of condo buildings here. There's like 3 builders that build all the condominium apartments here, complexes here. And they can build a 300-unit condo in like 6 or 9 months from the ground. And it's incredible. And they can do that because they've done it so many times, and they get better and better and better. And they're learning and using the data, incrementally improving their building process, their systems, and they're really productizing their builds, right? Owners typically, don't do that on the public sector. We do a poor job of that, right? So if you've built a college, gymnasium one time, great. Then, you probably should get better at using project gymnasiums. And so a surprising number of owners in the planning phase don't go back and reference like previous projects they've done that are similar, and like pull up that project data and see what went well, what went wrong, what risks were there, and truly prepare for that build. Now, they'll hire the contractor, they'll ask the contractor past performance and hire someone who's built gymnasiums before, but owners just do a poor job of it. So that's a component for me. And another one is just being able to go access that information in a quick and easy manner, right? So let's say an owner wanted to do it. Many times they can't because the documentation lives somewhere, it's on a hard drive. Remember, we used to do the project gold discs, a while ago. Go find the disc. Fortunately, we're not in discs very often. A good example I think of is I worked a project actually with the LaGuardia Airport, and I was in an OAC meeting, and there was a bit of a dispute about something that got built incorrectly. And the superintendent stood up and he's like, no. We talked about in the meeting, we agreed on have a documented decision. The contractor was like, no, you didn't, And in about a minute and a half, this man hopped in front of the room, opened up, they were using a Trimble product actually, flipped back and found the meeting where it was talked about. It was like meeting number 368 out of 700 or something. Picked the meeting, scrolled to it quickly, said, here's where you discussed it. Here's where everyone signed off on the meeting minutes. And the contractor was like, oh, okay, well, I guess we'll need to fix that then. And, that's a silly bit of it was a real example, but it's just a testament to being able to go find data, refer back to previous conversations, and quickly and efficiently, and prevent possible change orders, et cetera. So it's just super important and really neglected.
And Kent, in your experience, how can agencies access historical data to help strengthen project delivery?
Again, I'm coming from a Department of Transportation. We have a lot of historical data. We've built more than one bridge recently. We've rehabbed more than one bridge recently. We've overlaid roadways. We've widened roadways. We've done so much of this. We have historical data. The key for us is to not, when we talk about leveraging historical data, is to try to leverage it into a context of today. Bryan commented that historical data, we talked about 3 years ago, we have data that goes way back, and we can tell you costs, and we can tell you we did this, we can tell you we did this. The world keeps shifting. Our world keeps shifting. The expectations of our stakeholders keep shifting. And now I'm going to broaden that out. Obviously, it's the general public that we're building around, but it's also the resource agencies, and their world keeps shifting. Everything shifts and moves, and the historical data is very valuable, but you have to, when you lever that forward, you have to say, okay, that's historical, but now we are in a different environment. How does that change? How can I use that today to help me better understand what's going to happen to me today? And a lot of that is, I look at Montana. Montana is a fairly big state. I have some people from Texas. We're a small state. Okay, I take that right now. But Montana has multiple cultures to it. And if I'm building a project in one culture or the other culture, it's a whole different thing. And the historical data will tell me different things. The reality is those cultures are both changing in their own, and they're morphing in their own ways. And the expectations of those stakeholders are changing. So yes, that historical data is very important to me, but I have to leverage it into a context of today as I do it. There's a simple take on it, but it's not simple.
So a lot of what I'm hearing, it's accessing the changes that are happening today. How can we, what are best practices to incorporate your current environment with your historical environment to be able to deliver these projects more efficiently? And I don't know if maybe Bryan, if you have an answer to that question.
Ken just said as context, right? And it's just marrying the historical data, like what's transferable versus what's not in the current climate. And certainly, since COVID, how we build, it has changed dramatically. How we communicate has changed dramatically. So yeah, I think context is everything here. I think that's, probably already perfectly stated.
All right. And that is all I have. So we're going to move on to audience questions. And one of the questions that came about, what about asset lifecycle data to leverage for maintenance history? So what can we do about, I guess the question is asking, what about asset lifecycle data to leverage for maintenance history? So if you're trying to go with maintenance history, and I don't know which one of you gentlemen would like to take that question.
Sounds like an engineer question.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for that. Yes. Maintenance history is a tough one. And we're getting better at that. A lot of maintenance history is honestly lost. It's small things. And I've struggled with that before. A lot of maintenance history is available, but it's not in easily dug out forms. We talk about life cycle data, asset life cycle data. What I'm looking for there is a future, really. We talk about building information systems, bridge information systems. Those are all intended to be a life cycle repository of data for a project. and hopefully we're starting out now and we're getting better at that because we have the technology better now. I look at bridge maintenance history. I have bridges that are 50, 60, 70 years old, even 30-year-old bridges. The maintenance history of that is maybe on paper somewhere. It's not there. Digging that out is very, very difficult. Trying to get that into a easily accessible format is a real issue. And we talk about, it was brought up earlier, how someone left and took the keys to the system. Well, guess what? People are retiring, and there is a tremendous amount of institutional knowledge about that life cycle and the costs that is frankly lost when those people retire, because it's not institutionalized into an easily accessible form, as in a building information system or a project information system that is historical and can move forward.
Okay. Now, another question around data stored. It's one thing to have data stored in a single place. It's another to make it accessible to tell a story to benefit the agency. How do you recommend accessing the data that's being stored for agencies with limited resources? I think a lot of what we're also seeing challenges that we didn't discuss is limited resources, not enough talent to help with the projects. How can we deal with the limited resource aspect of it? And I don't know which one of you gentlemen would like to answer that question.
I mean, I think a first stab at it, and certainly limited resources is something that we all deal with. I wish I had access to more resources, financial and otherwise, right? But the data suggests, I'm a big math guy, so the data suggests and indicates, that investments in technologies to help with this almost always have a fairly significant ROI, right? So we are all dealing with resource constraints, and I'm sure we would all have lots of fancy systems, right? But a good project management information system, 99% of the time, but it is extremely rare that I have ever worked with, consulted in any capacity, an owner, an agency, or even a contractor that is not very happy with their investment in a good project management tool, right? The cost savings are significant over the projects to where the cost of the software actually becomes very insignificant. I'm not underplaying the investment. Certainly a significant investment on the onset, but after a year or two and all the money, time, and energy you've saved in the projects, it's often a no-brainer. In organizations that make that switch, they're not switching back. No one's going back to not having a PMIS system. And even equally rare, it's rare that they switch PMIS systems, right? Because they've done a good due diligence and selected a strong one on the front end. Not to say you can't do that, but I would say, again, not discounting the resource constraints, but the investment has a very real ROI and is often tenable. I would suggest to do some pro forma, some analysis, and understand that. Most tools are touting in a 1 to 2 or even 3% cost savings in capital projects, and that's significant.
And Ken, would you like to add anything to that?
I just have to agree with what you were saying there. The quality project management software is key to so much these days. You've got to have it. You need the tools, and the companies that use them, once they get them in and on board, they're a real asset to them. I just can't say that enough, quite honestly.
All right. Well, that is all we have for today. Gentlemen, thank you so much for sharing those insightful insights. And I hope everyone in the webinar really enjoyed this. And our next webinar is going to be at the end of the month, where we're going to be discussing on whether you should buy or build a custom solution. So be on the lookout for that email, and everyone have a great rest of the day.